Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kant 2b, the death of philosophy and the birth of physiosophia. If you didn't listen to 2a, Kant 2a, you really need to go and do that because diving into this section right here, it's not going to work. We're going to start with section 3 now. So in Kant 2a, I did section 1 and section 2. In part 2b, now I'm doing section 3, which is the analytic of the mind and the architecture of objective experience. So let us step into a room we have never entered before. Perhaps it's an old, dimly lit library. Immediately, an overwhelming torrent of phenomenal data crashes against our nervous system. Photons bounce off leather bindings and strike our retinas. Sound waves from a ticking grandfather clock vibrate against our tymphatic membranes. Volatile chemical compounds drift from the aging paper and bind to our olfactory receptors. To a completely passive receiver, a mere biological microphone or camera, this is nothing but a chaotic storm of disparate energies. There is no book, there is no clock, there is no room. There are only meaningless, disconnected flashes of light, sound, and scent. Yet we do not experience a chaotic storm. We experience a quiet library. We recognize the heavy oak desk as an enduring object. We understand that the ticking sound is caused by the swinging pendulum of the clock. We know that the desk and the clock coexist in a shared space. Modern neurophysiological experiments, such as multisensory binding through theta synchronization, they provide a vivid phenomenal illustration of this principle. However, we must not mistake the metabolic expenditure or the millivolts of a firing synapse for the transcendental unity itself. The I think remains a purely formal requirement of the understanding, a logical necessity that forbids the fragmentation of the sensible manifold. How does the mind perform this miraculous alchemy? How do we cross the threshold from the blind reception of raw sensory data into the spontaneous, organized comprehension of a unified world? Immanuel Kant recognized that the pure forms of space and time, the entorhinal honeycomb and the sweeping theta rhythm we have already mapped, all of this is necessary, but ultimately insufficient. They provide the stage and the timeline, but they do not populate the stage with actors. As Kant so perfectly distilled the problem, thoughts without content are empty, but intuitions without concepts are blind. The mind must actively step in, taking the raw sensible manifold and binding it together under universal rules. Kant called this active synthesizing faculty the understanding, and he charted its operation in transcendental analytic. Crucially, we must differentiate the empirical brain structures from the pure concepts themselves. The categories arise a priori from the logical functions of judgment, operating independently of the neural ensembles that merely illustrate their phenomenal application. The spontaneity of the understanding, place cells, and the categories. To comprehend objective reality, the mind cannot merely receive. It must synthesize. It must categorize. Kant derived a complete table of these pure categories. Rules like substance, causality, and interaction from the fundamental forms of logical judgment. He argued that these categories are not learned from the world. Rather, they are the a priori rules the mind actively imposes upon the world to make it intelligible. But as we peer into the architecture of the hippocampus, we find a phenomenal substrate through which the a priori categories are applied. We must remain vigilant. We are not observing the categories themselves in the neural ensembles, but rather the phenomenal organization of experience that necessitates these categories. Where the entorhinal cortex provides the universe spatial metric, that's the grid cells, the hippocampus proper houses what we call place cells. These cells do not merely fire based on abstract distance, they integrate multimodal sensory cues, the sight of the library desk, the smell of old paper, onto the grid coordinates. They represent the binding of the chaotic sensory storm into a stable, localized representation, serving as a neural correlate to the work of the categories. But it goes deeper than mere location. The hippocampal entorhinal network contains specialized conjunctive cells that encode logical relations that Kant identified. Some of these cells fire categorically, representing the persistence of an object across different visits, substance. Others fire hypothetically. They only activate if the organism approaches a location from which a specific direction encoding the logic of, if I walk through this door, then I will encounter the desk, the causality. Still, others fire disconjunctively, maintaining their activity across alternative routes to the same goal, encoding the logic of, I can reach the book via the left aisle or the right aisle, interaction and community. Furthermore, the brain relies on boundary vector cells, which anchor our spatial representations to permanent environmental edges. These cells provide the geometric permanence that allows us to distinguish our own subjective movement from the object or the objective unmoving boundaries of the room. The categories, therefore, are not abstract philosophical fictions. They are the highly specific logical binding operations that the hippocampus must perform to transform a mathematical metric into a world of enduring, interactive, and causally connected things. The hidden art of the schematism. Here we encounter one of the most notoriously difficult, yet brilliantly profound puzzles in the history of philosophy. Kant realized that the categories of the understanding, like causality, are completely abstract, intellectual rules. Meanwhile, the data of sensibility, like the visual image of a swinging pendulum, is completely concrete and physical. So, how can abstract, colorless rule ever attach itself to a concrete, colored sensation? They belong to two entirely different realms of existence. Kant proposed that there must be a third thing, a mediating representation that is both intellectual and sensible. He called this the transcendental schema. He described the schematism as an a priori rule governed synthesis by the imagination that applies pure concepts to time. It is not to be confused with the theta phase procession, which serves merely as an empirical illustration of memory and prediction. The schematism is the transcendental condition that allows the irreversible succession of events in time to be perceived as causal. And this schematism, as it seems when we're comparing Kant to biology, it would have to be purely metaphysical. Pure understanding meets sensible intuition within the temporal synthesis of the mind. The category is the rule. The schematism is the synthesis of time. The resulting behavior is the objective experience of a causal world. The pendulum swings necessarily because the mind's a priori synthesis projects its succession without gap, bridging the intellectual demand for causality with the phenomenal reality of motion. The coffee cup and the transcendental unity of apperception. So, we must now confront the absolute bedrock of human cognition. Kant recognized that categorizing objects and schematizing time would still result in chaos if there was not a single unified center holding it all together. If the mind that felt the heat of a fire was different than the mind that saw its light, there would be no unified experience of a hot fire. Kant declared that the I think must be capable of accompanying all my representations. If my perceptions did not belong to one identical consciousness, they would be nothing to me. This transcendental unity of apperception is the pure, original, unchanging logical necessity that precedes all sensory data. It is a spontaneous, purely formal intellectual condition without physical magnitude or energy. While neural synchronization is an empirical event that accompanies our perceptions, it is merely the correlate of this transcendental ground. Consider the experience of drinking a hot cup of coffee. The visual cortex registers the dark liquid. The somatosensory cortex registers the heat. The gustatory cortex processes the bitterness. These regions are anatomically separated, yet the subject reports a single, unified, instantly recognizable object. This unity is provided by the transcendental, I think, metaphysically speaking, the formal condition that ensures all disparate sensory impacts are owned by a single consciousness. All right, so let me restate some things and then really ground this. Kant declared that the I think, it must be capable of accompanying all my representations. If my perceptions did not belong to one identical consciousness, they would be nothing to me. This transcendental unity of apperception is the highest principle of human knowledge. It is the enduring I that spans the beginning and the end of a sentence, the single subject that owns the vast multiplicity of experience. In 2025, utilizing ultra-high field 7T fMRI coupled with intracranial recordings, researchers captured the physiological activity that accompanies this transcendental unity in staggering detail. Consider the sequence of this experience. The visual cortex registers the dark liquid contrast. The somatosensory cortex registers the intense thermal heat on the lips. The gustatory cortex processes the sharp bitterness on the tongue. The olfactory bulb receives the rich roasted aroma. These regions of the brain are anatomically separated. Left to their own devices, they would produce disjointed, schizophrenic flashes of data. Yet the subject does not report feeling heat, then later tasting bitterness, then later seeing darkness. The subject reports a single unified, instantly recognizable object. This hot cup of coffee. The 7T fMRI recordings revealed exactly how this occurs. As the subject took the sip, a massive globally synchronized theta frequency coupling engaged across the disparate sensory cortices, locking them perfectly with the entorhinal hippocampal modules. The theta oscillation acted as an electromagnetic glue, maintaining precise phase locking across the entire duration of the perceptual episode. The warmth, the bitterness, and the aroma were bound together because they were forced to fire within the exact same oscillatory cycle. When researchers introduced targeted transient theta frequency interference to disrupt this coupling, the results were profound. The experience instantly fragmented. The subjects could still feel heat, they could still smell an aroma, but the integrated object file dissolved. The unified I that held the properties together collapsed, leaving only a scattered, unknown manifold of perceptions. This persistent theta synchronization that prevents the sensory manifold from scattering across time, it actually provides the empirical conditions necessary for the manifestation of the transcendental unity of apperception in our conscious life. The I think that accompanies all our representations is illustrated in this temporal glue. Without it, we would be reduced to a blind swarm of impacts. With it, we become the authors of a stable, objective reality. Consolidating substance, replay, and the persistence of the world. If the I think unifies the present moment, how do we guarantee the world will still be there tomorrow? In his first analogy of experience, Kant asserted the absolute permanence of substance. Something must persist through all change. Otherwise, we could not measure time or navigate a stable reality. This persistence is an a priori requirement of the category of substance, independent of the empirical replay of neural ensembles. Subjectivist philosophers argued esse est percipe, to be is to be perceived. Kant violently rejected this, arguing that objective experience requires the a priori presumption of permanent substance. While the brain enforces this permanence through offline consolidation and sharp wave ripples, these are merely phenomenal correlates. The true ground of the persistence of the world is the categorical demand of the understanding. Radical evil in the forensic standard of accountability. During deep rest in offline states, the hippocampus engages in sharp wave ripples. These are explosive, highly compressed bursts of neural activity that occur superimposed on the troves of the brain's slower oscillations. What the brain is doing during these ripples is replaying the daytime sequence of the place cells. The library desk, the ticking clock, the spatial map, they're fired repeatedly forward and backward at accelerated speeds. This unified self is the prerequisite for human freedom, a capacity that stands distinct from the deterministic laws of biology. In the Kantian system, morality requires acting from duty alone, a principle that is strictly formal and independent of biological inclinations or primate prosociality. While neural synchronization provides the physiological theater for such actions, the moral law remains an a priori legislative force of pure practical reason. This distinction is vital for understanding radical evil. Far from a clinical or neurological failure, radical evil is an intelligible deed of the free will. It represents the conscious, non deterministic subordination of the moral law to the principles of self love. This choice is made in the nominal realm, remaining fundamentally distinct from the observable mechanics of neural synchronization or prefrontal activity. Similarly, moral accountability resides in the nominal will, independent of physiological conditions. The I that faces consequences is the identical formal I of the transcendental unity, a purely intellectual condition that serves as the forensic standard for justice. While the brain facilitates the continuity of memory and choice, the ground of responsibility is found in the unconditioned space of moral agency. The ideas of God and immortality act as unconditional postulates of pure practical reason. They are not biological requirements for systemic stability, but necessary conceptual horizons for aligning virtue with happiness. While the world of photons and neurons belongs to the phenomenal realm, the thing in itself remains a purely intelligible boundary concept, securing the space for a freedom that can be thought, even if it can never be empirically observed. So let us now turn to the great continental critics of the Kantian subject, thinkers who, in their own way, sought to unseat the very throne we have been laboring to secure. Martin Heidegger, in his monumental Being and Time, famously dissolved the Cartesian cogito into Dasein, a being whose primary mode of existence is not that of a detached thinking spectator, but of a throne absorbed being in the world, or through the world, I like to say. Heidegger argued that before we ever become reflective subjects, we are already immersed in a practical, equipmental context. We do not first encounter a room as a collection of geometric coordinates. We encounter it as a place to work, a shelter, a space of concern. The subject in this view is not a self contained ego, it is a mode of engagement, always already entangled within the world. Similarly, Jacques Lacan, drawing on the structuralist tradition, he proposed that the unified ego is not an innate given, but a construct born in the mirror stage, a developmental moment when the infant first recognizes its own image, and in that recognition experiences a jubilant identification that simultaneously introduces a fundamental alienation. For Lacan, the ego is an imaginary formation, a misrecognition that masks a fragmented, disjointed bodily reality, what he called the corpus mortale. The subject in his account is inherently split, lacking, and constituted by desire, never fully present to itself. These critiques have profoundly shaped 20th century thought. They have rightly challenged the naive realism of an autonomous, transparent self. They have exposed the historical linguistic and libidinal forces that produce what we call the subject. They are not, however, the final word. And here we must, again, be very careful. To dismiss them as mere pathology or cognitive collapse would be to commit the very error we condemn, a failure to engage with ideas on their own terms. Instead, we must ask, what do these critiques imply when viewed through the lens of the entorhinal hippocampal architecture that we have mapped? The neural data we have reviewed, the theta phase precession, the global synchronization of sensory cortices, and the indispensable role of the transcendental unity of apperception, these all demonstrate that a unified, temporally coherent consciousness is not a metaphysical fantasy. It is a physiological necessity for any coherent experience whatsoever. Without the binding of the sensory manifold under a single I think, there is no object, no memory, no intentional action. The brain does not merely construct unity, it requires it as a preconditioning for navigating a world at all. And this is exactly why language can just capture us in these different webs when we're talking about the same things, but we're having to separate the representations. You know, like this field has to stay into the transcendental, and this field has to stay in the neurological, and all of this has to be separated, even though we're saying the same things. One is of empirical science and proof, and one was the reasoning of one's own cognition, one's own experience as self. Heidegger's Dasein, with its absorption in the world, and Lacan's split subject, with its irreducible lack. And when I say lack, I mean like if you have, you feel tired, you sleep like 10 hours, but you still feel tired. Maybe you're lacking potassium. Okay, so in Lacan's split subject, this irreducible lack, not having. Um, so Heidegger's Dasein with his absorption in the world and Lacan's split subject with its irreducible lack, they do not describe a primordial baseline. They describe the outcome of a highly complex, fragile, and evolutionary recent achievement. The infant's mirror stage, far from being the fundamental truth of the human condition, is a developmental milestone on the way to a unified self, a milestone that the mature brain must maintain against the constant threat of fragmentation. And Heidegger's thrown this into the world is not a refutation of the Kantian subject. It is a phenomenological description of the empirical situation in which the transcendental subject finds itself, a situation that, as Kant himself acknowledged, it is always already structured by space, time, and the categories. The insight that physiosophia offers is not a condemnation, but a recontextualization. Heidegger and Lacan were right to question the naive, self-transparent ego, but they erred in treating the dissolution of the subject as an ontological given. The empirical evidence suggests that the unified self is not a starting point, but a constant achievement, a dynamic, synchronized process that must be actively sustained. To romanticize its dissolution is to mistake a failure of integration for a deeper truth. The fragmented, absorbed, or split self is not the foundation of being. It is the state of a system that has lost its binding coherence, a state that, in clinical terms, corresponds to disassociation, psychosis, or trauma. We can thus honor Heidegger and Lacan as incisive critics of a simplistic Cartesianism, while acknowledging that their ontological conclusions must be revised in light of the neural architectures that we have uncovered. The Kantian subject, far from being an obsolete fiction, emerges as a necessary formal condition for any possible experience, and we shall see for any possible morality. The unified I think is not a metaphysical ghost. It is the very engine of coherence that allows the brain to transform chaos into the world. To lose it is not to achieve liberation. Don't confuse yourself. It is to lose the capacity for freedom itself. This brings us to the threshold of section 4, where we will explore the moral implications of this unity. For now, let us plant this flag firmly. The unified self is the hardest won biological and philosophical achievement of the human organism. Let me say that one more time. The unified self, the I. You think I am like this. Oh, do you like hot sunny days? Yes, I like that. I like coffee with sugar and milk. I enjoy walks on the beach. The unified self is the hardest won biological and philosophical achievement of the human organism. It is the hardest one. The it is the it seems just as natural, this thing, and these philosophers can talk about it as if it's fragmented pieces, but it's not. It is the prerequisite for accountability, for justice, for love, for the very possibility of making promises that bind us across time. The brain maintains the I think against the manifold's chaos, allowing us to act as free agents. It is this very architecture, yes, fragile, expensive, and indispensable, that will become the foundation of the moral law we are about to investigate. Section 4, the dialectic, the override, and the primacy of action. Let us stand for a moment alongside an ancient map maker who has spent his entire life charting the contours of a vast, complex island. He has meticulously mapped the coastlines, measured the mountain peaks, and established a flawless geometric grid across the terrain. But eventually, he reaches the absolute edge of the continent. He stands upon a sheer cliff face, looking out into an infinite, fog-drenched ocean. Reason dictates that he should put down his pen. His instruments are designed for land, not the abyss. Yet an overwhelming compulsion grips him. His compass continues to spin. His mathematical grid demands extension, and his mind insists that the lines of latitude and longitude must continue across the empty water. The cartographer cannot tolerate the void. He begins to draw phantom continents in the mist. Why do we do this? Why is human reason never satisfied with the boundaries of empirical experience? In his Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant recognized a profound and tragic paradox at the heart of human consciousness. The very faculties that allow us to organize the physical world, our demands for causality, sequence, and unity, they all become weapons turned against us when we try to understand the ultimate nature of reality. Kant called this the transcendental dialectic. We are haunted by questions we can never empirically answer, but are constitutionally incapable of ignoring. Is the soul an immortal substance? Did the universe have a beginning? Is there a supreme being? When we try to apply our categories to these unconditioned absolutes, reason falls into inevitable illusion. We mistake our logical need for totality with actual knowledge of the infinite. For centuries, this dialectic was treated as a purely logical critique of metaphysical overreach. Today, we must recognize that the mind's reach for the infinite is an unavoidable illusion born from pure reason's logical demand for unconditioned totality, which has no basis in biological survival or physiological mechanics. The illusion of the simple soul ripples in the void. The first great illusion of pure reason is the illusion of the substantial soul. Kant dedicated a massive portion of his work to dismantling the paralogisms of pure reason, directly targeting the legacy of René Descartes. Descartes had famously stripped away the entire physical world in his meditations, finding certainty only in the I think. From this bare unity of consciousness, Descartes leapt into a massive metaphysical conclusion. He declared that this I was a simple, indivisible, immortal substance. It was a ghost hovering inside the machine. Kant fiercely exposed this as a fallacy of conflation. He argued that just because consciousness feels formally unified, we have no right to claim it is a literal, indestructible object. The I is the necessary functional accompaniment of our thoughts, the grammatical subject of experience. but it is not a substance we can weigh or measure or guarantee will survive death. To understand why the human mind so easily falls into Descartes' trap, we must first examine the paralogisms at the natural logical drive of pure reason itself. The I think is a purely formal requirement of the understanding, but reason erroneously attempts to treat this formal unity as a real substantial object. This mistake arises through invalid syllogistic inferences that push beyond the bounds of experience, seeking to transform the simple logic subject of thought into an indestructible metaphysical substance. This is a logical genesis of the paralogism. Kant warned us that the I is functional, formal coherence, not a metaphysical object. The illusion of the soul does not stem from sensory deprivation or neural idling, but from the transcendental subreption where the logical unity of consciousness is mistaken for a qualitative simplicity of a soul substance. Reason is seduced not by the dark of the skull, but by its own inherent tendency to seek the unconditioned ground of all internal appearances. Phantom fields and the antinomies of totality. In the paralogisms, well, let's put it this way. If the paralogisms deal with the illusion of the inner self, the antinomies deal with the illusions of the outer cosmos. Kant observed that when reason attempts to grasp the universe as a complete whole, it fractures into hopeless contradictions. Reason can construct equally flawless, mathematically rigorous arguments to prove that the universe must have a beginning in time and that the universe must be eternal. It can prove that matter is endlessly divisible and that it must end in indivisible atoms. How can pure reason be so hopelessly divided against itself? Kant's answer was the space and time of our own grids. And when we try to throw those grids over the universe in itself, the grid breaks down. We demand that the series of causes must have a definitive end because our minds cannot process an infinite regress. We, as subjects, we demand closure. The antinomies of pure reason are the strictly logical conflict of reason demanding an absolute totality of the synthesis of appearances. This conflict is driven by transcendental realism, the mistaken assumption that appearances are things in themselves. When reason attempts to grasp the entire series of conditions as a completed whole, it finds itself caught between contradictory but seemingly necessary propositions. This is an astonishing revelation. The brain is heuristically driven to seek systematic unity. The intohornal latest mirrors the mind's intolerance for an unmapped space or an absolute void. It will literally exhibit geometric continuity in its firing patterns rather than accept a break in its systematic unity. The antinomies arise not from physical extrapolation into a void, but from the transcendental illusion that the world exists as whole prior to our synthesis. This extrapolative drive is a demand of reason for systematic unity, but it becomes a dialectical disaster when we mistake this subjective requirement for constitutive knowledge of the cosmos. The grid of reason breaks not because of a lack of sensory data, but because it attempts to apply the conditions of sensibility to the unconditioned totality of the universe. The bifurcated will and the neurology of duty. We have seen the shipwreck of theoretical reason. Our minds generate the illusion of an immortal soul from offline ripples, the project phantom universes from our intolerance for the void. If our theoretical grasp of reality is so inherently bounded and prone to heuristic deception, where do we find our footing? How does a human being establish an absolute truth or meaning? Kant's answer was a revolution that changed the course of human thought. The primacy of practical reason. Theoretical reason can only tell us what is, and even then, only as it appears to us. But practical reason tells us what ought to be. We are not just thinking subjects, we are moral agents. But to act morally, we must confront a civil war within our own architecture. Kant recognized that the human will is not a monolithic entity. It is deeply bifurcated. He divided our volition into Willkür, our executive capacity of choice, which is heavily swayed by our biological appetites, inclinations, and the immediate sensory manifold, and the will, the will, the pure legislative will that gives itself the rational, universal moral law. When Willkür aligns with our animal appetites, we act out of self interest. To act morally, we must execute what Kant called Selbstzwang, the self constraint. We must force our executive choice to submit to the higher rational law, overriding our immediate biological desires for the sake of an invisible duty. This brings us to the zenith of human neuroanatomy. The biological theater of this Kantian civil war is actually located in the intricate circuitry connecting our primal navigation systems to the prefrontal cortex. Again, I shouldn't say it's actually there. It's not there. One is metaphysical, phenomenological, and one is empirical. So, again, we're not conflating here because we like to play language games. Okay. All right. So this Kantian civil war is located in the intricate circuitry connecting our primal navigation systems to the prefrontal cortex. The entorhinal hippocampal system, left to its own devices, is an engine of pragmatic survival. It maps the shortest path to food, the quickest route away from danger, and the most efficient strategy for immediate reward. It is the biological embodiment of Willkür, enslaved to inclination. However, the human brain has evolved an extraordinary top-down regulatory system driven by the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, and the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. The ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, acts as the brain's ultimate conflict monitor. When the primal grid demands immediate selfish consumption, but our social and moral frameworks demand restraint, the ACC detects the dissonance. It signals the prefrontal cortex to initiate top-down inhibition. The prefrontal nodes send suppressive signals down into the entorhinal loops, physically overriding the immediate biological impulse. The entorhinal prefrontal coupling is the empirical manifestation of Selbstzwang. And that is the self-constraint. It is the physical weight of duty. Through these loops, the predictive coherence of the theta sweep is radically extended. We are no longer just predicting the next step in a physical maze. We are now integrating long-term, deferred, and highly complex social outcomes into our sequences. The brain inhabits the immediate spatial map in favor of an extended ethical timeline. When a human being chooses to share a starving ration, to tell the truth at the cost of their career, or to protect a stranger at the risk of their own life. We are witnessing the highest achievement of the prefrontal override. The organism is leveraging its massive metabolic resources to suppress its own survival instinct in order to honor a projected universal law. This is how we simulate the categorical imperative. We use the machinery of space and time to navigate the architecture of morality. The noumenal boundary, a warning against conflation. At this point, a dangerous temptation arises, one that has destroyed brilliant philosophical systems in the past and threatens to derail modern neuroscience today. Looking at the magnificent power of the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal override, it is incredibly easy to declare, we have found it. We have located free will in the frontal lobes. The temptation is to claim that the top down inhibition is human freedom, reducing the grand mystery of moral autonomy to purely neurological mechanism. We must issue a profound, absolute warning against this. To say that the prefrontal cortex is the source of freedom is to commit a fatal philosophical error. It is the exact conflation of biology and metaphysics that derailed the successors of Kant. Following Kant's death, the German idealists, most notably Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, were deeply dissatisfied with Kant's strict boundaries. They hated the idea of an unknowable thing in itself in an unreachable noumenal realm. They attempted to collapse the boundary, pulling the infinite down into the finite, claiming that human consciousness was actually the absolute spirit coming to know itself. They tried to make the mind a god. If we look at the prefrontal cortex and call it the ultimate source of freedom, we are making the exact same Hegelian mistake, just from the opposite direction. We are collapsing the metaphysical into the biological. We must hold the Kantian line. The prefrontal override is an empirical event. It requires glucose. It is subject to blood flow, neurochemistry, physical injury, and deterministic laws. Therefore, it belongs to the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. It is the phenomenal manifestation of our freedom, but it is not the noumenal freedom itself. For Kant, the true spontaneous spark of freedom cannot exist within the physical universe of cause and effect. If our choices are merely the result of complex neurochemical reactions in the VMPFC, then we are not free. We are just highly complicated, unpredictable biological clocks. True autonomy must reside in the intelligible, nominal realm. It is an uncaused cause. We cannot map this noumenal freedom with an fMRI. We cannot dissect it in a laboratory. It is the true boundary of theoretical reason. Physiology is merely the stage upon which the moral drama is performed. It is the physical wiring that allows the noumenal will to move the phenomenal body. But the author of the play, the free, self legislating moral agent, remains forever outside the reach of the scalpel. We must think our freedom. We can never merely observe it. The primacy of action and the horizon of hope. Why then does the brain project phantom fields? Why are we haunted by illusions of totality, immortality, and absolute unities? We project these fields because, as moral agents, we require them. Theoretical reason fails to prove the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, but practical reason, the demands of our moral nature, insists that we act. When we exercise the prefrontal override, when we sacrifice our biological desires for the sake of duty, we are introducing a profound tension into our lives. We are demanding that virtue and happiness must eventually align, a union Kant called the highest good. But we look around the empirical world and we see that the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. The phenomenal world does not guarantee that morality will be rewarded. Therefore, to sustain our moral striving, to prevent our prefrontal override from collapsing into despair, we are forced to postulate a horizon beyond the immediate grid. We must act as if the universe has a moral author. We must act as if our moral progress can continue infinitely beyond our biological death. The phantom fields that our brain projects into the void are not just navigational errors. They are the biological echoes of our highest calling. As we cross the threshold into part 3, we will explore the absolute culmination of this architecture. We will see how these structural necessities, how they forge the apodeictic imago Dei, and how the navigating brain, fully aware of its own limits, freely affirms the postulates that make human dignity possible. The theoretical compass may spin widely at the edge of the cliff, but it is precisely there, at the edge of the unknown, that the moral agent learns to fly. But what happens when the moral agent, having exercised the prefrontal override and orientated the will toward the universal law, looks out upon the empirical world and finds no guarantee that virtue will be crowned with happiness? The righteous suffer, the wicked prosper. The phenomenal realm, as we experience it, offers no necessary proportion between moral worth and worldly reward. If the moral law commands unconditionally, yet the world refuses to honor that command with consequences, then the very coherence of the moral life seems to hang in this balance. Here we encounter the deepest exigency of practical reason, one that Kant himself identified as the unavoidable horizon of moral striving. The mind, having mapped the spatial manifold with its hexagonal lattice and bound the temporal flux with its theta sweep, it now confronts a different kind of manifold, the moral manifold of duties and obligations. And just as the entorhinal grid demands the postulate of a shared objective space in which navigation is possible, so the moral will demands the postulate of a world in which virtue and happiness are ultimately united. This is the highest good, the summum bonum. And without its conceivability, the categorical imperative would be a command issued into the void, a compass pointing toward a destination that could never exist. For Kant, this exigency is not a failure of reason, but its highest achievement. He demonstrated that theoretical reason could neither prove nor disprove the existence of God or the immortality of the soul. Yet practical reason, in its inescapable demand for moral coherence, is compelled to postulate these realities, not as objects of knowledge, but as necessary conditions for the possibility of the moral life. The soul must be capable of endless moral progress. God must be the guarantor of the ultimate harmony between virtue and happiness. These postulates are not articles of faith in the theological sense. They are the regulative poles of the moral compass itself. And now, in the light of physiosophia, we can see this demand reflected in the very architecture of the brain. The predictive future simulating machinery of the eternal hippocampal system is constitutively orientated towards systematic unity and the maximization of long-term coherence. It cannot tolerate a horizon of absolute futility. The prefrontal networks that sustain abstract, universal rules are the phenomenal substrates of a will that demands a world in which those rules have ultimate significance. The postulates of God and immortality are not arbitrary hopes. They are the necessary regulative assumptions that a cognitive system orientated towards systematic coherence must adopt if it is to sustain its moral striving without despair. They are not deduced from the brain, but they are demanded by the logic of practical reason that the brain makes possible. We shall explore this apodeictic architecture in full in part 3. For now, let's simply note that the moral navigator, having crossed the quantum neural bridge and charted the space of appearances, now faces the most profound question of all. Is the moral law a law with consequences, or is it a law without a judge? Kant's answer, and the answer that our neural architecture itself suggests, is that we are so constituted that we cannot act morally without acting as if the judge exists, and as if our moral striving can continue beyond the grave. The postulates are not optional, they are the very fuel that sustains the engine of duty. As we turn to part 3, we will see how these postulates, once regulated to the realm of pious hope, become the apodeictic imago Dei, the image of God reflected, not in the heavens above, but in the moral law within, and in the living tissue that makes that law audible.